good afternoon. Sorry for the slight delay as we get set up here, but I think we're all good to go. So I'm Jonathan Fung. I'm a faculty member in physics and astronomy. And on behalf of the What Matters to Me in Hawaii Organizing Committee, it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome you today. This is actually the 11th season of What Matters to Me in Hawaii here at UCI. And so we're very happy to be kicking this off here with Jonathan Alexander in just a bit. But some of you, therefore, have been to many of these. Some we know have been to tens of them, and it's like a regular thing with you, which is great. Some perhaps have never been to any of these. And so let me then, for those, just describe a little bit about what you are going to see. So What Matters to Me in Hawaii is basically a chance for members of the UCI community to get to know each other on a sort of personal level through talks given by faculty and staff. These are informal, fairly short talks, and followed by ample time for Q&A, so you'll have lots of time for that at the end. Speakers are basically asked to answer the question, what matters to them and why, and that's it. And so there's no pre-assigned program or topic. It just goes wherever it goes from there. We have had now, because we've had 7 talks a year for 10 years, 70 talks. They've been absolutely fascinating. People have talked about their personal journeys, disappointments along the way, the joys revealed, their beliefs, their motivations. It's just a fascinating series, and I think it's quite unique here on UCI's campus. So what we will do now is, well, let's see, this is first some administrative notes. So if you are shy about being on videos, you shouldn't sit in the front few rows. So as you see, we videotape everything here. Second, we are a counterexample to the famous saying that there's no free lunch. There is a free lunch, but as a concession to the pandemic, instead of you eating it here in the room all at the same time, which we did for the first 7 years, it's a grab and go lunch. So just remember, on your way out, there's a table being set up out there with all the lunches. Just pick one up and eat it on the grass outside or at your office or wherever you like. I'd like to also mention that this is not the only series like this at UCI. As any good, movie or TV, we have spin-offs. And so there's actually a health sciences spin-off series, which will have some talks later in the year. But also, most relevantly, there's an alumni series. And so this is a series where alumni, people who were undergrads here in years past, come back from whatever distinguished, fascinating thing that they've ended up doing and come and tell us about it. And so, especially for the students in the room, it's a great chance to hear, not just where they're at, but how did they get there and what did they think about their UCI experience that helped them to get there, and maybe they have some advice that would be useful for you. And that series, not only is it a counterexample of not a free lunch, it's a counterexample there's no free dinner. There's actually a free dinner at that one, okay? So if you want, sign up for that. The next one is actually very soon. It's coming next week on Thursday. That's October 13th, I think. And that's Carlos Feliciano, who graduated in 2006. I think he was actually even president of ASUCI when he was here. But he's gone on and he's now actually a criminal investigator for the Office of the Inspector General, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security. So it's an interesting job. And then again, this is sort of the main series on campus, and next month there'll be another one in November, and I just ask you to look out for the registration for that. The next speaker will be our Vice Provost and Graduate Division Dean, Jillian Hayes. So thank you for coming. We have a tradition here because we draw people from all across campus, and both faculty, students, and staff, to actually have a 1 or 2 minute time when you get to say hi to the person you're sitting next to, who you may not know. Okay, so please do that. And people on Zoom, I think, will be stuck in breakout rooms. Just a very brief time, say, what department you're in, what you're studying, are you faculty, staff, or student? And then after that, I'll ask my colleague on the organizing committee, Joseph Morales, who will come up and introduce our speaker.
So thank you so much. Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Morales. I am the Associate Director for Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships in the Office of Inclusive Excellence here at UCI, which always feels like so much. On behalf of the organizing committee, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jonathan Alexander. And before I give an illustrious biography, I just want to say something more on a personal note, which I didn't check with Jonathan beforehand, but I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank Professor Alexander, because when I first arrived here at UCI, Jonathan was one of the first people I met, and he was very welcoming and very supportive. And I think in an academic space, those are really, creating a sense of belonging is essential, right? It's critical. So I just wanted to thank you for that. I keep that in mind all the time as an example of something to aspire to. So thank you. So now to the biography. Jonathan Alexander is Chancellor's Professor of English and Informatics here at UCI. He also serves as Director of the Humanities Core program. Entering his 30th year as a higher educator, Jonathan is the author, co-author, and co-editor of 22 books. Just wanted to let that sit in. 22 books. And he has served in numerous administrative positions here on campus, including campus writing coordinator, founding director of the Center for Excellence in Writing and Communication, chair of the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies, equity advisor for the School of Humanities, and associate dean in the Division of Undergraduate Education. As a researcher, Jonathan's work focuses on the teaching of writing, the development of writers across the lifespan, the rhetorics of popular culture, and the power and role of narrative and storytelling in democratic cultures. Jonathan also writes creative nonfiction and has published four critical memoirs, the most recent being Dear Queer Self, in all caps, an experiment in memoir. Friends, colleagues, guests, please join me in welcoming Dr. Alexander.
Thank you very much, Dr. Morales. And I also want to thank Dr. Fung for the invitation as well. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've admired this series for quite some time, and I genuinely mean it. It's an honor to be able to speak with you. Dr. Fung said that I could not have the 4 hours that I originally requested, which is fine. And I also appreciate Dr. Morales' kind words. It was very easy to welcome him to UCI. Whenever somebody goes to introduce you by saying, I'm going to start with a personal note, you always think, oh, this could go many different ways. I'm glad that it went well. Okay, so what matters to me and why? Oh, where do I start? I've been talking about this with some friends in the last few weeks, because while I've always wanted to do one of these and was so excited to get the opportunity to talk about what matters to me and why, as soon as I had the invitation, I'm like, oh, what does matter to me? And, I started looking around my home and started thinking about, well, what does a home say about someone and about what they might possibly matter, what might actually matter to them? And see if I can actually get the PowerPoint to work. There we go. These are the things that apparently matter to me. This is in my bedroom. That's one corner of it. That's another corner. It's where my husband sleeps on that side. It's with the unsecured bookshelves. That's by my side. That's my bedside reading. This is the guest bedroom. That's also in the guest bedroom. We don't have shelves for those yet. This is even worse, just books stacked on various things. This is part of my Humanities Core office. Started moving stuff in there recently. Oh, and here's a bookshelf. Again, more stacks, the table. This is my office in Krieger Hall as a faculty member. So I guess as I started joking with my friends, what matters to me is books. Books. Now, obviously not just books. As one of my dear friends said, Jonathan, you can't say that what matters to you is books. We're at a moment when you should be saying things like the environment and social justice. And I'm like, well, okay, yes, yes, absolutely. Those things matter a great deal to me. But as I thought about it, I realized all of the different ways in which, not just as a professional hazard of being a professor of English, but books matter a great deal to me, and they were in some ways a very significant gateway for me. And so I began thinking about, and gateway to a lot of different things. And so I began thinking about what books have meant to me. Now, kind of funny thing, after this is, as Dr. Morales said, my 30th year being a professor of English, which is still in my mind a little surprising, because when I was in grade school, I was not a particularly very good student. I was sort of off in my own world, doing my own thing, thinking my own thoughts, not really paying attention. I was not a reader. In fact, in what we called reading and language arts, I was kind of a C student. And I even at one point got a deficiency. I don't know if they spoke of deficiencies for poor performance, but I was coming close to failing language arts and reading. And I thought, oh my God, what? I don't want to do that. I don't want to go to summer school. That's going to interfere with my, important things like play. So I tried to figure out, well, what could I do? And I was a sort of shy, nerdy kid in 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade. But I credit a teacher that I had for reading in the 5th grade who was a big fan of the library and would frequently take us into the library, and took us one time and checked out a book, showed us how to check out a book, and said that she was going to read to us every day from this particular book. And when you think about books, my point at the time was I don't know what they're really good for. They don't necessarily seem to do much. They're not particularly useful. But this teacher read to us every day from the work of an author who I'm going to talk about in just a moment. But she very much believed, with the great 19th century Victorian poet and thinker Matthew Arnold, pictured here, that books contain, as Arnold puts it, the best of what has been known and said. And that's very much what a lot of education about books and about reading focused on at the time. And many of us still believe this to this day, that this is what our literature contains, the best that has been known and thought. I was maybe a little more in this camp. What can we do with the book? I don't know what it's good for. What does it mean to be the best that has been known and thought? And is that true? Well, she was bound and determined to teach us that this was the case. And so every day, the book she checked out of the library and read to us a chapter from was C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. How many of you have read this book or maybe seen the film? This is a very popular book, written in mid-20th century by a Christian apologist and the novelist, Lewis. And in it, a story of 4 kids during war-torn England sent away to a kind of relative's house in the countryside to escape the bombing in London. And they kind of have the run of the house, and it's 2 boys, 2 girls. They're running all over the house playing. And they find this old wardrobe, this huge standalone closet, and one of them is hiding in it, while they're playing hide and go seek. And the little boy discovers that there's no real back to the wardrobe. He thinks he keeps going through the coats trying to find the back of the wardrobe, and he's pushing through, and then he keeps going, and he realizes, oh, it's just, there's no back. And soon the fur coats that are hanging in the wardrobe start to feel rough, and they become the bark of trees, and he finds himself all of a sudden in a snowy clearing. And he's in Narnia. And the entire Chronicles of Narnia series, 7 books, it's all about the adventures of not just these 4 children, but other children as well, who come across the realm of Narnia. And Narnia is a sort of parallel universe. There are good things in it. There are bad things in it. It's a magical land. And The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in particular deals with the story of these 4 children encountering a wicked witch, a snow queen, who currently has Narnia under her control, and the fight between that queen and the lion Aslan, who wants to regain Narnia for the good. The Snow Queen, she's evil. She keeps everything cold. Aslan, good, gentle lion, wants to return Narnia to a land of peace and plenty for its people, and the children help him do that. So while Mrs. Cermak, my 5th grade reading teacher, was reading us this book, it was a good kid's story. There was magic, there were bad witches, good lions, all of this kind of stuff that appealed to young people. Towards the end of the book, it becomes clear that really the only way Aslan can save Narnia from the evil Snow Queen is by sacrificing himself. In a rather grisly set of chapters in which his self-sacrifice actually is what saves Narnia. And Mrs. Cermak, while she was reading this to us, kept asking us, does this sound like anything? Does this sound like a story you're familiar with? And all of us were like, I don't know. Rudolph? We don't know. What does this sound like? And she said, this is the story of Jesus. Jesus sacrificing himself to save humanity. And sure enough, this is what The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is. It's a children's allegory, right? Allegory, the term for one story being used to refer to or to tell another story. And Aslan's self-sacrifice parallels Christ's sacrifice for humanity. Now, I'm going to fast forward quite a bit. The Christianity in the book did not stick with me. But the power of the book to do something different, to tell another story, to refer to another world of possibilities, that very much did stick with me. And the very first book I ever picked up and read on my own was Prince Caspian, which is the 2nd book in the Chronicle of Narnia series. I'd never read a book before. I went out, took my money, bought that book, and read it, the first book. And then I didn't stop. I kept reading more and more fantasy, more and more fantasy. Fantasy, of course, in a lot of bookstores is next to science fiction. So I started reading more and more science fiction. Here's a picture, by the way, of the Snow Queen. It's Tilda Swinton in the Disney version. I just had to put that in there. But I kept reading more and more books, science fiction, some historical novels, etc. So here I am, 5th grade, moving on, getting into high school. It's the early 80s, 1983, 84, 85. How many of you were bullied in high school? I bet some of you. I was really bullied in high school. And so books for me became a way to protect myself, because no matter how often I was bullied, no matter how often I was called a fag or a faggot or a queer, because those were the terms of choice for me when I was being bullied in high school, no matter how often I was told that. And then once I got home, I could open up a book, and there I would be. I could escape into Narnia, right? Or Middle Earth, or be on a spaceship somewhere. That's what books did for me. They offered me that opportunity to go someplace else. So it's 1980s, very difficult time for me, not an easy time, the thing known as high school. And in 1984, a film, this is not what I looked like, by the way, in 1984. In 1984, a film comes out called Dune, directed by David Lynch, and it has a star-studded cast, and it's based on a very famous science fiction novel by Frank Herbert, originally published in 1965. And so here I am. I like fantasy. I like science fiction. Oh my God, I got to read this book. I actually have to read this book so I can go see the movie. And for my little nerd life, this was incredibly exciting. That a book in a genre of fiction that I was particularly interested in was being made into this incredibly hyped film. And I really, really wanted to see this film. But I remember, even more importantly than seeing the film, I remember reading a passage early in the book about this man who is portrayed in the David Lynch film in 1984. It's the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. And he is the villain. There is no doubt. He looks bad, right? He looks like a villain. I think in the next slide, here's the cover of the original printing of Frank Herbert's Dune. In the remake of Dune, how many of you have seen this one? Yeah, this is the Baron, how he's presented in this particular film. I think this is better, I have to admit. If you're going to have a villain, let him really look villainous. But even more than that, I remember reading in the book, even before I saw the film, about the Baron. And not only was he clearly evil, not only was he clearly the primary antagonist, full of vengeance and hatred for the people we were supposed to identify with, the good Atreides, he had some very peculiar and perverse habits. And so one of his primary habits, when he needed his own relaxation, was he would demand that young men be brought to him, drugged, so that he could rape them. Now, in the new Dune, this is not portrayed because we live at a moment in which we just kind of really don't, we don't want images of gay people to kind of look like that. We don't want images of gay or queer people to seem like that. But and even in the 1984 Dune, it was kind of gestured at, not fully portrayed, when the Baron decides to murder a nice-looking young man who is brought in. Now, I have to admit, these scenes were absolutely fascinating to me. It's 1984, and I'm reading this book, originally published in 1965. This was the very first time in the book, and then again gestured at in the film, that I saw something that could be called homosexual. This is my first image of seeing one man be sexually interested in another man. Now, keep in mind, I had been told numerous times that I must be a faggot, queer. And I suspected in my heart of hearts that that was true, that is, in fact, what I was becoming. But at that time, there were really no widely circulating positive images of gayness or queerness. Instead, there was this one image that Frank Herbert had written in the mid-1960s into his book, so that just in case you didn't know that Vladimir Harkonnen is evil, his queerness would seal the deal. That's what made him truly evil, truly despicable. And that's even sort of picked up a little bit in the film as well. You can see he even has his fingernails painted. Clear signs of queerness. I read them and was fascinated because I had not seen depicted before. Now I knew that I was supposed to understand this as a bad thing. That in fact, I was living at a time in the mid-1980s, a time of the emerging AIDS crisis, when the President of the United States wouldn't even say the word AIDS, wouldn't even say it, while thousands of people were dying. And everyone around me, relatives, members of my spiritual community, members of my school community, were convinced AIDS is God's just punishment on the homosexual. They deserve to die. This is what God has sent to the planet to kill off the homosexuals. And in fact, what we need to do is actually try to move them to camps so that they can be away from and not infect the general population. This is an image by the AIDS activist and artist David Wojnarowicz, who photographed himself essentially being buried alive because that's how many gay people felt at the time, that they were being buried alive, and not just by a disease, not just by a virus, but by a government, by a culture, by a state, nation that just didn't care, that wanted them to die, wanted them to be buried. So here I was, growing up in this world, thinking about these things, and I'm reading about Vladimir Harkonnen, obviously an evil man, but the very first thing I ever read about one man possibly being sexually interested in another, I began thinking about that as, I know I'm supposed to understand this as I'm evil, because that's what I'm interested in. But instead, I also began understanding it as I'm powerful. Maybe other people call me evil. But in fact, maybe this is a kind of weird power that I have. Maybe this is kind of a way of being different, of being more. And so what I began doing is thinking about how I needed to read stories differently. I could read them exactly like I was told to read them. I could read them like Mrs. Cermak wanted me to read them. I could read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as an allegory of Christian salvation and through self-sacrifice. I could read it that way. But I also knew that I could read Vladimir Harkonnen as evil, and his homosexuality, his queerness confirming his evil, or if I were to survive the world I was in, which thought of me as evil, then maybe what I could do, what I needed to do, was to read that story differently. Read it not with the grain, but against the grain. Sure enough, if you keep on reading in Frank Herbert's Dune series, you discover that Vladimir Harkonnen is evil, but also the person he's fighting against, Paul Atreides, is super evil. And his son, even worse. So even Herbert had a sense that evil maybe is positional, that what we understand as evil is changeable. But the lesson I took away from both C.S. Lewis and also perversely from Frank Herbert was in fact perverse. It wasn't that I needed always to read with the grain, but that I needed sometimes to read against it. And that sometimes that's what we do to survive. Reading is not just accepting what it is that we are told, but it's just as much about asking the questions. Why is this presented the way it is? And so I began thinking about this in my own life and in my own writing, and realizing that I needed to tell different kinds of stories. And so I'll conclude in just a minute by saying that this young man, this was my uncle. He died when I was 12 in the mid-1980s. He was a gay man. Everyone thought he died of AIDS in the mid-80s. And he very well might have. At the time, AIDS diagnoses were not very clear always, and it could be confused for other things. Officially, he died of multiple myeloma cancer, but it very well may have also been the case that his end was hurried by AIDS. And he became a kind of figure within my family, a warning to all of us, but also in some ways a warning to me. I can't tell you how many times my family members would say, "You're so much like your uncle." And I knew what they were telling me. Be careful, you could wind up like him. And I realized, what would the Baron do? Kind of a perverse question. Well, something can be evil, but something can also be told that we can be told that it's evil, and then maybe not. And so what I did with my uncle, within the next, 15, 20 years, began thinking more and more about his life, picking up pictures, doing some of my own investigation. And just a few years ago, I collaborated with an artist, a UCI artist, Antoinette Lafarge from the School of the Arts, to produce an exhibit and a book called Burning Time, which is set in New Orleans, where I grew up, where my uncle died, where he had gone to try to live as a gay man, And I began retelling his story. I began telling his story of what I imagined of it because I had to make it up. It wasn't really given to me. Nobody was telling me about how wonderful it must have been for him to arrive in New Orleans, find a gay community, and start to flourish as a young person, as a young man. But I needed that story. I needed to write that story. I needed to reimagine him in different ways. And I love how Antoinette has sort of traced his figure. It's the figure of him living on in my mind, in my consciousness, telling his story, telling a story counter to the one that I had been told about him as a warning about what would happen, what was justly the deserts of gay people. And so I told this story, and Antoinette beautifully illustrated it. I wrote poems and paragraphs, kind of trying to imagine what it would have been like for him coming of age as a gay man in the 60s and the 70s, and trying to find a life. Because I needed a different story. I needed a counter story. I needed not to accept the story that had been given the way I was supposed to read the story of his life as an allegory for God's punishment. Instead, to read his story as one in which he was trying to survive. He was trying to make a life. All of us encounter elements of our lives that eventually we will not be able to overcome. But until then, it seems to me that I found a way for books at least to provide me some of that insight, that inspiration, that way of thinking, the way of being with myself and with others, that is not just always about reading and ingesting and accepting everything I'm told, but sometimes also questioning, countering, reading against the grain. What matters to me? Well, it's not just books, but it is that act of really thinking hard about the things we've been told, about the world that we have been given, about the stories we've been told about it, and questioning what parts of it are useful for us to survive, and what parts of it do we need to tell differently in order to survive. I think that's what matters to me. Thank you. Okay, so questions?
Yes, so thank you for this wonderful talk. We now have time for questions and comments. So if you have them and you're in the room, please raise your hand and we will bring a mic to you. This way, not only will you be heard in the room, but also on the audio recording, okay? If you're in the Zoom audience, I think you can raise your virtual hand and we will call on you and unmute you, or you can also type your question into chat and we will read it out for you, okay? So let's start with questions in the room.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was wonderful. I'm curious, what memories in creating this project around your uncle and rewriting his story, did you tap into memories you had of him, and to what extent did you remember him?
Thank you, Professor Rahimia. That's a great question. As Dr. Morales said, I've spent a lot of time working on memoir and thinking about memoir, and that really that's often memory, right? It's a project of remembrance and memory making and memory recovery. And so it was particularly interesting for me to write about my uncle because, there were a lot of things that I had forgotten. And so I could tell you one very quick story. He loved to make costumes. So he was a really butch guy. So why people thought I was like him, I don't know how that, but he was a big butch guy, and he worked for the telephone company, and had sort of an engineering kind of job, but he loved also to make costumes. He lived in the French Quarter, so for Mardi Gras, right, tons of costumes. For Halloween, he would come over and make our Halloween costumes. And one Halloween, I must have been about 10 or 11, he brought over this extraordinary huge black cape and black headdress. I mean, it was just with sequins. It was sort of, I look like a drag queen Darth Vader. It was extraordinary. And I'm like, it even had like these poles so I could hold out the cape. it on and sort of went around the house. And my parents said, no way, not gonna happen. We don't want you to wear that. Probably wise on their part. I might have had my ass kicked. So it was fun to kind of recover some of those memories, and even just recovering that memory alone and thinking about it. It made me realize that, and maybe this is related to books, because books are often repositories of memories, and how much we forget. And that part of maybe what should matter to us is not forgetting. But it takes effort to remember. I think our entire culture is dealing with that right now. There are a lot of things we want to forget about our society, but we shouldn't. It takes effort to remember, and it's not always easy, but we learn about ourselves, and we learn how to do better, hopefully. So thank you for that.
Another question here.
Thank you, Jonathan. I know that your lovely mother lives with you now. And in part knowing that and hearing you talk about your experience as a child in a different part of the world, in the country, I'm curious about what some of your thoughts are when it comes to that other place as you tell the story and this place where you live.
Thank you, Professor Gross. That's a wonderful, wonderful question. Besides meeting and building a life with and marrying my partner of 25 years this December, Mac, the thing that I think I am most proud of and grateful for is moving my mother into our home 5.5 years ago so she could be with us. Everyone in my world said, "You're insane. You're gonna let your mother live with you? What is wrong with you?" And I thought, no, it just felt right. It felt like the absolute right thing to do. But also felt like the right thing to do because we had worked on that relationship for a long time. And my mother would tell you that when she was younger, she really did not want me to be gay. Desperately not. But now, all these years later, decades later, she calls Mac her son. That she recognizes that she has now 2 sons, and how lucky and fortunate she is. It takes effort. Place also takes effort. And I often will talk about growing up in the Deep South, growing up in New Orleans and Louisiana, and that part of the world as that other place. And that always makes me feel a little sad because I don't feel like I ever got the chance for whatever number of reasons, whatever forces of the world that were working on me at the time. I didn't get a chance to experience myself queerly in a really kind of extraordinary place. New Orleans is an extraordinary place. I think that's what was so important about my investigating and writing about my uncle, because that was allegorical for me. I wanted to imagine the possibility of being queer in that place because I felt like I didn't have it. I couldn't imagine that when I was there. And so all these years later, imagining him was a way to get a sense of that, or at least to recover a sense of that sense of home. Does that help? Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you for such a powerful talk. I love how you talk about books, but it's more than books. It's about reading. But even more than reading, it's almost like against reading, right? It's a kind of alternative reading. I would like to know what's your advice for our young students here, right? So sometimes when we read a book or read something, we feel, well, I don't know what to think, or I know what I'm supposed to think, but it doesn't feel right. Or we feel we are stuck in here, right? What's the breakthrough that you advise people to do, like to take them to a different place?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. And you're right. I'm not against reading. I'd say I'm against Matthew Arnold, right? who says that books are the best of what has been known and said. That's a toxic formulation for some people, because there's a lot in books that is actually very, very harmful. So in the Humanities Core course right now, we are reading Plato's Republic. It's one of the foundational texts of Western philosophy and thought and political thought. And oh my God, it is really a dangerous, difficult, incendiary, outrageous book. I mean, it is full of really difficult, toxic things even from some perspectives. And yet I was talking with some of my faculty and we're like, we just love reading this. It's just so much fun because it's so provocative. You can see how so many people have adapted it, have used it, have learned from it, have been harmed by it in many ways. And I think that that's what I encourage young people to do, which is to cultivate what I call the pleasure of difficulty. The pleasure of difficulty. Books can give us difficult thoughts. Not just the best that has been said and thought, but dangerous, difficult thoughts. They can push us. They can challenge us. They can piss us off. And that engagement is absolutely worth it. Opening yourself up to that kind of engagement is worth it. But read also from what it is that you know about the world and from what it is you're learning about the world. I encourage people to read things that are not just going to confirm what they know. We can all do that. We can all read things that confirm our sense of the world, but instead to seek out the kinds of reading that will challenge them. Not that it will change their minds. I'm loving reading the Plato. I do not want to live in his republic. He is not convincing me 2,500 years later that I want to live in his republic. But reading him is sharpening my sense of why I don't. It's helping me understand better why I resist some of the things he says, why I resist some of the ways in which he has been used and adapted and promulgated over the millennia. That's worth it. So reading like I read Frank Herbert, right? I'm reading it against the grain. I'm reading it so that I can find ways to survive my life, so I can better understand our current situation, our current culture. That's worth it. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. That was really, really fascinating.
Oh, there you are.
The
Okay.
way you describe your reframing of the Duke, that seems like this incredibly healthy mindset to have, like a refusal to hate yourself. Like, does that just did that come naturally to you when you were that young, or is that something you really had to fight for?
Oh, got it. Yeah. I think I still fight for that in some ways, you know. I think this gets back to something that I was thinking about in response to Professor Rahimier, that part of living with memory, recovering memory, exploring it, is that you get reminded about those difficulties. And you also begin to see how you continue to live with those difficulties. Our pasts, I mean, we try to say, oh, it's all in the past, you know, move on, and yet your past sticks around, even in ways that you don't always want it, or even in ways you're not always aware of it. And so for me, having within me that capacity at 15 or 16 to say, I know I'm supposed to understand this as evil, right? That's why Herbert made the Baron queer. It's making him evil. And yet to also begin to recognize in my flesh that I was responding to this representation. I was responding in my body to this picture of sexual intimacy between two men. However convoluted, however degraded it is, it's like it's at least something I'd not seen before, something I was curious about. So for me, that was sort of a breakthrough moment. But it's one that I had to continue to construct over and over and over again for years. And actively sought out healthier representations, healthier ways of seeing this. And surely there were. I just didn't have access to them at the time. They weren't circulating. You can turn on television right now and see a lot of queer and trans characters. I could turn on the television in 1985 and see the movie star Rock Hudson, his skull pushing through his face as he's dying of AIDS. That's what I could see. I urge the young people in the room not to take for granted the world that you have right now. I know it's difficult, but what should matter to you is everything in it that is good that you want to hold on to, because it doesn't have to be that way. Within just the context of my life and of the lives of other somewhat older people here, we've seen tremendous change. We've seen a lot of progress. Don't take that for granted.
I think there was a question here.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. I was fascinated by the story of your realizing how you learned to read things differently and against. And I am curious how much of that realization of you as a reader shaped the way how you write. And do you ever think about, how your readers might be reading differently and against? So I'm just kind of curious about that kind of your relationship as a writer and your relationship as a reader and how that kind of, influence each other.
Thank you for that. That's a lovely question, because that sort of at 15, at 16, that realization that I could read differently, that I needed to read differently, that actually has defined my scholarly career. The vast majority of my work as a scholar is actually really about that practice. And so one of the things that I do as a scholar is I'm very interested in fan media, fan fiction. And that's all about people taking preset universes like Star Trek or Star Wars or Harry Potter or whatnot and reading it differently, putting in other characters, doing different things with it. So I just published a paper a couple of years ago with my colleague and friend Rebecca Black in the Department of Informatics, in which we looked at autism and neurodiversity in Harry Potter fan fiction. And that was a study. I mean, there are no autistic characters in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter universe. I mean, she didn't put them in there. But fans do. People who read that universe will adapt it, to take it, and they put characters into it that they need to see, that they want to see, with issues and with challenges and with opportunities and possibilities that they want to explore. It's one of the amazing things. This started decades ago with Star Trek. Gene Roddenberry really wanted to have gay characters in Star Trek. Television producers would not let him do it in the 60s. Would not let him do it. They wouldn't even let them do it in the 90s. Not really. But fans did it. They put the gay characters in there because they wanted to see it. They wanted to be able to do it. So my whole scholarly career really has been about exploring precisely that issue of people who read against the grain, who take these narratives, take these stories, take this shared mythology of popular culture and adapt it to their own purposes, to see themselves in it, to explore things that are important to them. It would only be fair for somebody to read one of my books and do the same thing to me. And I hope they do. It is really interesting. It's a huge privilege, actually, when somebody comes to me after I've read from one of my books and said, I was listening to that passage and I wonder what you would say to something completely different. Maybe you're misinterpreting your own experience, Jonathan. And all I can say is, God, you may be right. Maybe there's a whole other way to think about the things that have happened to me. But I think that's also how we generate possibility. That's how we open up creatively and imaginatively possibilities for living. It's like we have to think beyond what it is we've been given. So, thank you.
Okay, I think we're about out of time. So let me just thank all of you for coming. And then let's all thank Professor Alexander for just an absolutely wonderful, powerful talk.